Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Staying Keto on Passover. It's not a miracle. My name is Izzy, and I'm your Kosher Keto coach. I'm really happy that you're going to be taking the time to listen to this guide, and I really hope that you get something out of this as Passover approaches. Whether this is your first year on keto or your fifth, this guide was developed with you in mind. You are a person who wants to stay on keto during the upcoming Passover holiday, and you don't want to get off ketosis, yet you're observant and traditional at the same time, and you don't want to disrespect the holiday, yet you want to stay keto. Now, as we get moving on to this presentation, I just want to let you know I'm not a rabbi. I have consulted with rabbis. I've consulted with readings from the sages and many halachic sources for some of the information that's included in this presentation. As always, you're going to be the final person who decides what you're going to do, and obviously no one here is judging. So just to, just get some house rules going here. I have one recommendation. If you're currently not on keto, but you want to start, I really recommend that you wait until after Passover. It's not the best time to start for obviously all the reasons that we're going to be explaining in this presentation. My suggestion is that you, during the holiday, if you haven't started keto yet, to try to consume as little carbs as possible. Focus on protein and leafy greens and low-carb vegetables. I would recommend you skip the desserts and continue to get super excited about starting keto after the holiday. Since you're not on ketosis now, which is the presumption if you haven't been on keto yet, I think everyone's objective here is to actually get on the scale the day after Passover and be at best or at worst the same as entering Passover. So Passover, the first night, is Friday night. So my suggestion is that Friday morning you get on the scale, record the number, and then don't get on again until Sunday morning or Monday morning after the holiday. And then be the judge of hopefully no collateral damage and or whatever damage you've suffered through the holiday, and then just start again. Keto is forgiving. You could be back in ketosis and back on track within a couple of days. So, if you're the listener who is already on keto, I'm here to tell you that you can do both, and it's going to take focus and work. Of course, it's worth it, but if you're not focused, it might actually take you weeks or longer after the holiday to recover. The good news is that most of the difficulty comes from the Seders on the first 2 nights, but after that, the rest of the holiday can be smooth sailing for someone on keto. Just a reminder, the danger of Passover is not only trying to stay keto, but to remain in the range of normal caloric intake. It's wrong to think that if you're on keto, how many calories you consume doesn't matter. Okay, just some basic ground rules. We're going to continue and get some more ground rules as we go. So let's start with an overview of Passover and keto. Let's begin. Okay. So the slide that I've just focused on now is called Passover Basics. So what's the whole big deal about Passover? So basically, on Passover, you're forbidden to eat leavened bread, which is the Hebrew word for that is chametz. Many of us, regardless of our observance, are familiar with these words, whether they're Yiddish, Hebrew, or English. Chametz is any food product that's made from the main grains, wheat, barley, rye, oats, or spelt, that's come into contact with water and allowed to ferment and rise. From all your Hebrew school and yeshiva education, you know that if bread or wheat or any of these grains have been allowed to rise for more than 18 minutes, it no longer constitutes matzah that can be available for Passover. In practice, just about anything made from these grains, other than Passover matzah, which is carefully controlled to avoid leavening, is considered chametz. So there's an observance level as well. This includes flour, even before it's mixed with water, cake, cookies, pasta, breads, and items that have chametz as an ingredient, like malt, for example. That's why beer is not permissible on Passover. The prohibition of eating matzah comes from the main 5 books of the Bible, and that's why it's a very serious prohibition to not eat chametz during Passover. The Ashkenazic rabbis in the Middle Ages became more strict in their observance and also forbade the consumption of something called kitniot, which some people translate as legumes, on Passover, so they won't be confused with the forbidden grains. In tradition, we call this building a fence around the fence. So even though kitniot aren't the 5 grains, the Ashkenazic Jews, since the Middle Ages, have followed the tradition of not eating rice, corn, soybeans, string beans, peas, lentil, mustard, sesame seeds, and poppy seeds, in addition to the grains that we discussed before. This ban was accepted as a binding law by Ashkenazic Jews even today. Now, the confusing thing for many people who aren't as observant is that if you come from a Sephardic background, that is, if you come from the Southern Europe region, Spain, Italy, and also in the Middle East, or if you know your family is of a Sephardic background, Sephardim do not hold by this prohibition. So if you went to a Sephardic home for a Seder, for example, or had a meal during Passover, you would see all these forbidden kitniot, not chametz, of course, but the kitniot. They eat rice, they eat soybean, they eat string beans on Passover. So it's a little bit confusing, and Ashkenazic Jews know what they're not supposed to do, and Sephardic Jews also know what they can and can't do. Okay, so that was the basics of what you can and can't have on Passover, and everything, all these prohibitions derive from that. Let's just review real quick keto basics, because we need to know both basics and see what exists. So on this slide, what I've done is outline the basic elements of food that you can have on keto, and that's very keto friendly. So we have the vegetable groups, we have fats, we have other carbs and proteins. For those of us who are on keto for any length of time, all these different food groups and food items are very familiar to us, and we know that these are the staples that keep us going on keto. The good news is, if you look at this list, there is only a few things here, as I'm looking at the list with you, that potentially could be prohibitive on Passover, specifically for Ashkenazim. There's nothing here on this list that's innately prohibited on Passover. Now, I'm just looking at some of the nuts and seeds, but except for potentially some of the seeds, which you should ask your rabbi, I don't see here any of the issues that Ashkenazim should be concerned about. So you can see that the stuff that you eat, the foods that you eat on an ongoing basis every day, are basically foods that you can continue to eat on Passover. Now, a word of caution. Obviously, Passover is a more stringent time of the year. For those of us who are observant to very observant, we try to get foods such as coconut butter, olive oil, just as an example, that have a kosher authorization for Passover. So you always look for some familial symbol, kashrut symbol, that also says that it's kosher for Passover, and that's very, very important. So, and in keeping with the way we keep and try to stay in ketosis, on the left you see that you try to keep a minimal of 70% fat, 20% protein, 5% carbs, and it says here 5% vegetables, but the truth of the matter is, when it comes to leafy greens or low-carb vegetables, you can't have enough. It's certainly not harmful in your daily caloric count. Okay, so we have so far the keto basics, and then we also have the Passover basics. So let's get to the Seder, because quite frankly, the two Seders are the biggest issues for people staying on keto. The rest of the holiday, there's no halachic or rabbinic or requirement to eat matzah per se. Many people hold, the more observant, that if you, on the festival days, the first 2 days and the last 2 days, have a festive meal, you need to wash and eat bread. In this case, you would eat matzah. So many of us will take into account the fact that perhaps you need to eat matzah on those days. The reality is that, I look at I keep keto for many reasons, including, and not minimally, my health. Since I've been on keto, my health has gone up tremendously. I'm so excited and exhilarated by the lack of inflammation and the way I feel. So for me personally, to minimize the eating of matzah, on festive meals other than the Seders, I'm going to I'm doing this for a health card, so to speak, and minimize the size of the matzah that I eat, even if I wash, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But let's get back and talk about the Seder. Okay. So hopefully, you're at a Seder that has as many people as this, because, a big family or Seder table gets to be a lot of fun. But even if you're having a Seder by yourself or with a small family, Jews all over the world have been celebrating Seders since the Exodus. And for these thousands of years, it's been one tradition that no matter how observant you are, you still keep. And it really is part of who we are as Jews, and it has connected us throughout the years. So one of the main keto elements that we need to discuss on Passover are the 4 cups. Everybody is familiar with the Haggadah. Everybody also is a guide as to the process of how to conduct a Seder. We all know from experience, if we've had Seders before, that we're required to drink 4 cups of wine. And on keto, you know that could be an issue. So let's discuss what we can do. Some basics about wine in general, and then discuss what we're going to do on Passover. So the average wine cup size, when we make kiddush, or we bless and sanctify the meal with wine, is typically 4 ounces. Even if you don't have a 4-ounce wine glass, we're going to use 4 ounces as our base. So there are many rabbis who hold that the minimal amount for ritual observance is 3 ounces. So just keep these basics in mind. Some of us don't like wine or can't drink wine, so we've relied on grape juice. The bad news on keto is that grape juice has significantly more carbs per ounce than wine. And if you're reading along with me, you can see the numbers. 4 grams of carbs per ounce is in 1 cup of grape juice. That equals 1 ounce. So for a 4-ounce cup, you have 17 grams. That's a tremendous amount of carbs in a 4-ounce cup. Now keep in mind, the observance is to drink 4 cups. So before we get to the cheat sheet, so to speak, for Passover, if you didn't know better, you would think, and you couldn't drink wine, you would think, I'm going to have to drink 4 cups of grape juice, and I'm going to consume 17 times 4 grams of carbs just for the wine. We haven't discussed yet the matzah. We haven't discussed the meal. And already you've blown out your daily typical requirement of carbs on keto. So as you can tell, it's very disconcerting. So if you can get away with not drinking grape juice before we go to the cheat sheet, you're really recommended to do so. Let's discuss some of the wines out there. The general recommendation is that you stick to the dry wines. If you have a Merlot or a Cabernet Sauvignon or Pinot Grigio or Sauvignon Blanc or Chardonnay, you're going to get, on average, 3 grams of carbs per 4 ounces. So whereas a grape juice has 17 grams for 4 ounces, you're going to get way less in a cup of semi-dry to dry wine. So again, it's not rocket science, but you can see that if you're going to pick your poison, so to speak, you are more than likely to try to find a decent semi-dry or dry wine so that in a 4-ounce cup, you only have 3 grams of carbs. So even typically on a Friday night or in general, if you want to drink the whole cup undiluted, you're not going to really blow out your carbs per se. And this is a general recommendation for people who want to drink wine on keto in general. So just to summarize so far, before we get to the shortcuts, you want to stay away from grape juice, and you want to stay away from sweet wines. You want to stay in the semi-dry to dry area. Okay, so now that we know the basics, what are we going to do on Passover? So now let's go over to keto wine basics and see what we can do to make this all manageable. There are many rabbinical sources that state for several reasons at any time you're allowed to ritually dilute the wine, which means that the wine can be diluted and still be considered wine for the purpose of sanctifying the meal and sanctifying the blessing over the wine and still be properly observant. So here's where it differs a little bit, and this time the Ashkenazic Jews once again come out ahead on the story. If you're a Sephardic Jew, you can dilute the cup to 51% wine. What does that mean? As a general rule of thumb, if you have a 4-ounce cup, if you fill a little bit more than half of it with the wine of choice and the rest with water, you're still considered having completed the blessing in a proper manner for observing the blessing. Now, Ashkenazic Jews can actually dilute it a lot more. So there was a famous rabbi back in the Middle Ages called the Ramah, who came up with his interpretation that if you dilute the wine 16%, and it's 16% wine and the rest water, it's still considered wine for blessing purposes. Now, I put 20% because 20% is 1/5. I think many of us can kind of try to figure out that a little easier than 16%. Taking out some sort of cup and measuring is probably not going to be what you're going to do at the time. So let's just summarize. Sephardic Jews can dilute the cup to 51% or a little bit more than half, and Ashkenazic Jews can dilute it to 1/5. The truth of the matter is, when the rabbis in the Middle Ages came up with these numbers, the wine at the time was significantly stronger than the wine today. And many rabbis say that these percentages don't really hold today because wine in general is weaker. But for people, for health reasons, if they go to the rabbi and ask for these exemptions, 99.9% of the time, you'll get the exemption and not rely on the fact that the wine was weaker or stronger many, many years ago. But by diluting the wine to 51% or 20%, you can see that the carbs become more manageable. So now, if we go back to our dry wines, if we have 3 grams of carbs in a 4-ounce cup of dry wine, let's say Merlot, and let's say if you're a Sephardi, you're going to have 51% of that diluted. So you're not going to be consuming more than 2 grams of carbs per 4 ounces, and you're going to be doing that 4 times. You're only going to consume 8 grams of carbs. So for those of us who are worried to have too many carbs in general, you can now see that the whole wine issues become very manageable. Keep in mind that the 4 cups are the first 2 nights of Passover only. After that, you are only obligated on festival meals if you make the kiddush. If somebody else is making the blessing over the wine instead of you, they have you in mind, and you don't really need to drink a full 3 ounces if someone else is making the blessing, let's say dinner a couple of nights later on a festival evening. So hopefully this has been really helpful and kind of made you a little bit more calmer about, how am I going to get through drinking all that wine from a carb perspective. Also, keep in mind that if you keep in mind for a second, the meal is going to take place in the evening. And the reality is that if you're going to be eating a meal at 9 o'clock at night, 9:30 at night, by the time you get through the Seder to the part of the Seder that has a meal. So now many of us are not really used to eating a full meal at 9:30 at night. It's daunting to think that for 2 straight nights, for many of us on keto, we have to deal with the issues of drinking 4 cups of wine for 2 straight nights and eating all that matzah and carbs plus a meal after 9:30 on a given night for 2 straight nights. It's a very daunting prospect. So take a step back. If we know this ahead of time, plan your day accordingly before the night meal. Try to have a meal before more than 12 hours apart. If you can intermittently fast until you get to the Seder and keep your normal intermittent fast interval before the Seder, that's awesome. But keep in mind that right away, the first part of the Seder is to drink the first cup of wine. So even before you have food, if you remember from Seders past, everyone sits down at the Seder, and the first thing you do is you hear the blessing over the wine and you drink your first cup. So it really behooves you to try to dilute, if you're really serious about keto and you're just coming off an intermittent fast, the prospect of having 3 carbs of wine or 17 grams of carbs on grape juice. Well, grape juice isn't going to make you drunk, but having all those carbs on an empty stomach, you may want to think about diluting it. But the important thing to remember is that you're going to be eating a meal at 9:30 at night, and you're going to be drinking wine at probably 8:30 that evening. So you want to space your meal before the Seder even begins appropriately to stay in keto. And if that's your intermittent fasting schedule being changed for the day, just a word of caution and discussion. Let's go over the non-keto matzah basics before we try to see what we can do to make it manageable. So keep in mind, if you are very observant, this is very familiar to you. If you're not observant, get ready. Ritually speaking, you're obligated to eat matzah 4 times during the Seder. Remember, we have 2 Seders coming up. The first is when we make the blessing of the matzah, someplace 1/3 into the Seder. Right before the meal, there's a whole area of blessings. So there's a blessing specifically on the matzah. There's something called korach, which is one of the steps following the matzah, where you take a portion of the middle matzah and you eat it. And then many of us are familiar with the Hillel sandwich, where you take 2 pieces of matzah and you put in the moror and the charoset, and you make a sandwich, and there's a special prayer that you say. And then after the meal, we of course are always excited to have regular dessert. But after the regular dessert that our families have prepared for us or our friends, there's something called the afikomen, which is a ritual dessert. Afikomen doesn't mean get out the gifts and bring it out for the kids, which has become the custom over the years. And that's because we always want to keep the kids involved in the telling of the story, which is the basic reason we have the Seder in the first place. But the afikomen is specifically the ritual dessert. It's actually the last time we're eating matzah that evening ritually, and we're required to eat a decent amount of matzah as dessert before we make the blessing for the meal and continue on with some of the prayers. So here's the bad news. The minimal amount that you can have for ritual observance without any health issues is 1 ounce per time. And 1 ounce of matzah is about 28.5 grams. Now again, some matzahs have 27 grams, some matzahs have 26 grams, but it's a lot of grams of carbs, okay? Now, if you buy, whether you buy handmade shmura matzah, which means guarded matzah in a box, I'm not handmade, I apologize, machine-made matzah, or any matzah in a box, those squares are about 1 ounce, which is about 28.5 grams of carbs. Now that I've spoken to you about how many times in the Seder we actually eat the matzah, let's go over some of the basics of matzah. So 1 ounce of matzah is usually about 28.5 grams of carbs. If you take out a square matzah from a box, whether it was handmade or machine made, those squares are around 1 ounce. Some of them contain 28.5 grams of food and approximately 25 to 27 grams of carbs. So keep in mind, 1 square out of a box is going to be about 1 ounce, and it's going to have 25 plus grams of carbs. If you are observant, or if you like eating those large, round, handmade matzahs called shmura matzahs on Pesach or Passover, each one of those round ones is around 2.5 plus ounces. 2.5 plus ounces is going to give you about 77 grams of food. And usually in those round ones, there's about 66 plus grams of carbs. That's a lot of carbs. And for many of us who don't try to eat more than 25 to 30 grams of carbs per day, we're looking at the prospect of eating a whole week's worth of carbs in one sitting. It's very, very scary if you're on keto. So now what do you do? Okay. So let's see what we can do here. So let's review some of the keto matzah basics. So many rabbinical sources state that if you need to, for health reasons, you only need to eat half of the normal requirement and still be ritually observant, so to speak. Now, they base this on that we have a terminology called a kazayit. Kazayit is Hebrew for a large olive. So there are rabbinical sources that hold that every time you ritually are required to eat a matzah, if you eat the size of a large olive, you've been ritually observant. Now, the rabbis do state, most of the rabbinical sources that many of us, regardless of Ashkenaz or Sephardic origin, we rely on the fact that many of the rabbis say that for their Seder, it's really important to eat 1 ounce per ritual requirement, and that the large olive or kazayit size is typically only permissible, so to speak, during the festive meals, during Passover, or in general whenever you ritually need to eat matzah, that you can get away with the size of an olive. Again, always check with your rabbi. Let him know that you're on keto, and let him know that the primary reason you're doing this, of course, let's say you want to lose weight. That's the reason you started on keto. There isn't anyone who isn't going to derive a health benefit from losing weight. That's just the reality. You lose weight, and your body, better health just comes with it. So when you speak to your rabbi, whether you're doing it to lose weight or specifically you want to reduce inflammation or all the other main keto health benefits, let him know that you're serious about your health and you are serious about your ritual observance. But at the same time, you want to make sure that he understands that ingesting all these carbs after a period of time when you've had 30 carbs a day is going to have a negative reaction on your body. He needs to understand that this is a health requirement and not just so that you can fit into your bathing suit for the beach. So, having said that, what can we do? So the bottom line is this. For the Seder, if you are wanting to stay ritually observant and want to comply with many of the rabbinical holdings, even for health reasons, you can eat per time that you ritually are required to, whether it's the blessing on the matzah, whether it's the korach, whether it's the Hillel sandwich or the afikomen. You could rely on, for health reasons, only having a half an ounce per serving, which is a half of a square matzah and a quarter of a round matzah. And I don't need to do the calculations for you. Even if you do half, you're still going to be eating about 15 grams of carbs per half portion, which is going to put you in the 60 carb range just for the matzah. If you want to eat the size of a large olive, it's probably even half of that. So that becomes more manageable. The only consolation I can share with you is that it's only the first 2 nights. It only happens to be the only 2 meals for Passover that you really need to be so cautiously observant about eating that many carbs for matzah. And the bottom line is, nobody's going to judge you if you decide to eat less because you really know your body and you're concerned about a negative reaction to the carbs in general. So I've armed you with the basics, and we can go from there. This basically covers the worst of the potential issue with carbs on Passover. Okay, so we're actually getting to the end of the presentation, because the reality is that for the rest of Passover, after we get through the carb horrors of the Seder, we go back to our basic illustrations, and we actually see that there's lots and lots that we can eat and stay totally within our keto regimen. So for example, if you have a caloric amount that you want to stick to on a daily basis, and you certainly want to stay within the pie chart of fats, proteins, and carbs, you can stay exactly the same on Passover. Passover is extremely keto friendly, other than the Seders, as I mentioned. Keep in mind that for many of us, it's important to be using products, because we're kosher, that have kosher authorization. And even if we're a little bit more lenient during the year, there may be some product that they put in that they don't even list because there's a trace of it, that for many of us, we want to see that there's an actual, for coconut butter or mayo or things like that, that we're looking at products that have authorization for Passover on them. So pay attention to that. First and foremost, stay within caloric guidelines. There's a basic rule in weight loss. If you consume more calories than you expend, you will never lose a pound. So that's just the basic tenet, regardless of what food program you're on. If you want to lose a pound, you have to expend more calories than you consume. You have to expend 3,500 more calories more than you consume, and at that point, your weight will go down 1 pound. So my recommendation to my clients is, just because you're on keto, you cannot ignore caloric content and amounts. I have a fixed amount every day I try to strive towards, and I urge you to also. That's just a general keto tip. But on Passover, it's something that you really need to adhere to. Stay within your caloric guidelines. It's important to practice intermittent fasting throughout the holiday, especially between the Seders. So the day of the first Seder, which is not yet the holiday, it will be really important for you to practice intermittent fasting before the Seder. It would be equally important after the Seder to practice intermittent fasting before the second Seder, to give your body a chance to recover somewhat before the next onslaught of carbs. And then throughout the rest of the holiday, I would up my intermittent fasting lengths to get my body back into keto ASAP. It's important, because this is Passover, and depending on your level of observance, to always check the ingredients for Kosher for Passover supervision. I am the Kosher Keto Coach, so I will always give you the guidelines based on kosher requirements. Stay away from processed food, just as always. So, for many reasons, if you eat the basics, if you make things from scratch, you'll keep observance on Passover a lot better, and you probably have a better handle on the nutrients and what's keto friendly and what's not. And of course, as we've been discussing, aside from the Seders, you can stay keto most or all of the holiday. Now, as I said to you at the beginning of this presentation, the end game, ideally, is to stay in ketosis, end up in ketosis the day after the holiday when you test yourself, whether it's urine strips or with blood. The scale says that you haven't gained any weight, hopefully, that would be your end game. If you didn't reach those objectives, either you gained more weight or you're off ketosis, then feel comfortable that probably if you get back on track and do keto and stay back to the regimen you had before Passover, there's a high probability within the first week after Passover you'll be back on track, and then you're smooth sailing. If you have questions, contact me. As you can see on the screen, I give you my cell number. You can call or text. I gave you my email account and my Instagram. I'd love to help you. I'm happy to answer all your questions, and it's been really a pleasure and an honor to do this presentation for you. I want everyone to have a wonderful Passover, and hopefully a keto-friendly Passover. And I urge you to contact me during Passover with any questions you may have before Passover or after Passover. I love to do this. I'm very passionate about helping people, and keto works for me, and I know it'll work for you. So have a great and happy and enjoyable Passover with your friends or family, and call me if you need help. Have an amazing holiday, and thank you.